Agile software development methodologies like Scrum are great when they're used correctly. Whereas in the old waterfall style of development, it's easy to find your team wasting time on unneeded planning documents and delivering features that weren't quite what your customers needed. In Agile, your team stays focused and delivering real value to the company. Unfortunately, it's really easy to misapply some of the Agile practices. Today we'll take a look at common Agile best practices and the reasons behind them, as well as some of the ways that your team can get derailed in applying them. Then we'll take a look at how to get back on track. By the way, a big thanks goes to today's sponsor, Atlassian, for helping make today's screencast freely available to everyone. We'll start today with sprint planning, how to make sure that your team has selected a group of stories that they can actually deliver this sprint and that will deliver real value to your company. Then we'll take a look at user feedback, how to make sure it's not getting lost in the shuffle. And finally, we'll look at testing, some best practices to ensure that technical debt isn't creeping into your project. We're going to take a look at a series of emails from a fictitious company who's using Agile, and they're not getting it quite right. We'll see correspondence between a team's Scrum Master, Product Owner, Developer, and other team members, and they'll break various Agile rules as they go, changing requirements during a sprint, not sticking to the team estimates, breaking the sprint schedule, and so on. We'll see exactly what goes wrong in each of these scenarios, and then talk about how to make it right. Selecting a group of stories that your team can deliver successfully within a sprint can be a surprisingly difficult task, so we'll start today with best practices for sprint planning. We'll talk about the importance of not changing stories during a sprint, the importance of keeping the duration of each iteration the same, about how the people who actually do the work should be the ones to estimate the effort involved, and the importance of keeping the product owner available to answer team questions. So here we've got an email from our product owner to one of the developers on the team. He says, by the way, and that phrase itself makes alarm bells go off for me. By the way, we're also going to need to be able to feature certain products at the top of the page. Okay, no big deal. We'll add an additional story to the backlog. Oh, wait, no, he wants it to be part of the demo at the end of this sprint. And our developer's a good, quote, team player, unquote, so he starts scrambling. He realizes there will be a lot of additional work to try and fit this feature in this sprint. Maybe he initiates the additional planning that'll be needed to do these features right. Maybe in his haste he starts making incorrect assumptions about how it will need to work. He also has to coordinate with other team members in mid-sprint to figure out what additional tasks will be needed. It's an important rule in Agile methodologies that during a sprint or iteration, no changes are made that would affect the sprint goal. Why is this? Well, your team, including the product owner, has done a non-trivial amount of work planning the stories that will go into this sprint, including tasking them out. Theoretically, your team has taken on as many stories as they can handle this sprint, so other stories will need to be discarded, and if work towards them has already taken place, then that work is effectively lost. It also increases the risk that other features you're working on might not get delivered successfully, or worse, will be delivered with defects. Another important rule of Agile methodologies is for all iterations to be the same duration, usually 2 to 4 weeks. The reason for this is that it simplifies planning and allows everybody to establish a regular rhythm. Unfortunately, our intrepid example Scrum team seems to have lost sight of this fact. Faced with having to report that they failed to deliver a story last sprint, they opted instead to extend the sprint by 2 weeks. That's left a couple members of the team sitting idle, and they've chosen to fill the time by incorporating a pet feature of theirs. Extending the sprint is causing planning problems, too. Here the Scrum Master is replying to the product owner, who thought that a feature would be ready to show it to a client because it was supposed to be released at the end of the last sprint. Our Scrum Master replies to remind the product owner that that was the sprint that got extended, and that even though the code is done and tested, it hasn't been part of a release yet. Situations like this are the reason Agile methodologies require iterations to be of a short, consistent duration. It reduces miscommunication during the planning process. If there's problems with the selected feature set, it helps to detect them sooner. Maybe that extra dialogue isn't needed as badly as originally thought. If there's problems with your development methodology, this will find them out sooner. Maybe extra testing is needed, or needed integration servers aren't in place. Having a known end date to the iteration helps keep your team focused and give them a sense of urgency. And it helps keep extra features from creeping into the project without appropriate oversight by the stakeholders. So what should an Agile team do if they face a choice between extending a sprint and failing a story? In most cases, the right answer is to let the story fail, then just pick it up and finish it up in the next sprint. Doing otherwise misses an opportunity to inquire into what went wrong and how the process can be improved in the future. And while there may be some disruption, it's definitely less than what will be faced if the sprint is extended. Agile teams provide estimates of how much work a story from the backlog will take. Maybe they use planning poker to assign points, maybe they estimate the number of hours of uninterrupted work it'll take. The particulars are up to your team. What's important for maximum accuracy, though, is that the people actually doing the work be the ones to provide the estimate. That way, only the amount of work the team can actually do will be selected for an iteration. Here we see a QA tester warning the Scrum Master that a web service hasn't been tested properly. If the tester were present during estimation, and if those estimates were followed, then the team would have known that this functionality can't be tested in the same way that everything so far has been. And it may be that only a tester has the sufficient expertise to warn the team of this. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, it looks like this message fell through the cracks, and the product owner selected just as many stories as usual for this sprint. This is why Agile methodologies have a rule that only the team actually implementing a story should estimate the effort required to complete it. They have unique insights into the type of obstacles that will come up. Perhaps additional testing is required for a story, maybe extra software or hardware will be needed before development can commence. They'll be the ones to know about that sort of issue. And yes, sometimes their estimates will be excessively high. This is why the product owner should be on hand during the estimation. If incorrect assumptions have been made about the depth of the requirements, they can clear up that sort of misunderstanding then. There's another side to the coin. The developers may be the experts on how to implement features, but the product owner is the expert on what features need to be implemented, and in what order. When the product owner isn't available to answer team questions, the team suffers. This can easily happen if the product owner is just pulled in from another department within the company. There's a reason they're a domain expert after all. And the product owner duties are just added to their existing duties. Your team's product owner was selected for that role because they have unique knowledge about the domain you're working in. Maybe they've worked more with your customers in the past, maybe they've been a customer themselves at some point. That's why they're needed to be on hand during estimation to offer clarification about the acceptance criteria for a story. And at first, stories won't have sufficient acceptance criteria to implement them. They need to be able to answer developer questions about that as well. It's really a full-time job, and unless your product owner has been given sufficient time to devote to their role, quality is going to suffer. Getting user feedback quickly is one of the best reasons to move away from waterfall-style development. After all, without it, your team is flying blind. But unless you've taken steps to make it easy, your users may not speak up. They're busy after all. Today we'll take a look at some best practices to make sure that user feedback is part of your development cycle. We'll talk about why your team does that demo after each and every sprint, and we'll talk about how to make feedback easy for your end users and the consequences if you don't. Here we've got an email from the Scrum Master to one of the developers informing him that 3 sprints worth of work needs to be backed out of production. That's a significant amount of time and money, of course. And what was the source of this fiasco? A simple misunderstanding about the functionality that was being worked on. Evidently, while working on some behind-the-scenes web services, the team broke its habit of demoing every sprint. Maybe they felt the product owner lacked sufficient technical expertise to understand what was going on. Regardless, it was only 6 weeks later when the UI was completed and demoed that the issue was caught. Agile development frameworks have a requirement that progress be demonstrated every iteration. The only alternative to this is long-winded progress reports, which can easily be misinterpreted. Stakeholders need to see the product as early as possible. They don't have time to read detailed specs. Besides, working software offers a much clearer picture of how everything will work. A clearer picture allows better planning, and better planning means less wasted effort. Once your system is in production, it's important to get feedback from end users as well. Here we have an email from a product owner wondering why the few customers that are providing feedback seem to be going through him rather than the designated support channel. The customer email he quotes can provide some insight into that. It seems the support page they've been given has a bunch of required fields that they don't know how to fill out. They're being asked for a product version, an environment, which we already know would be production, a release control code, and a database ID. Really, the only field on this form that's useful at all is the issue description. The QA tester knows what's going on. Those fields are actually from an internal tool. Apparently, the team doesn't even have a feedback form that's appropriate for use by external users. He's proposing a workaround that's kludgy at best. Just like your product owner and other stakeholders, you need feedback from your end users too. But they're also busy people. Make it difficult for them to give feedback and issues will go unreported. Make it easy and their feedback gives you a chance to boost product quality. Don't ignore what you get either. It's easy to file issues where relevant and then forget about it. Don't do that. Read it in stand-up. If you're getting positive feedback, it'll boost your team's morale. And if you're getting negative feedback, that offers opportunities to change your practices and improve. You wouldn't build a house on a cracked foundation, and likewise adding features to a broken code base is a recipe for disaster. We'll wrap up today by looking at some best practices to ensure that testing receives proper attention from your team. We'll talk about why testing should occur with development instead of after, and why a shared definition of done among your team members can help ensure that proper testing takes place. So here we have an email from a developer to one of the QA testers. He talks about how he worked late finishing code for an overdue feature, and now he won't have much to do until the end of the sprint. It looks like he plans to just sit around waiting for defects to come back from QA so he can fix them. This is despite doubts that QA will have enough time to complete their testing before the end of the sprint. Throwing code over the wall and waiting for defects like this is a bad idea. Testing is far more effective in tandem with development. Having a separate test phase discovers bugs after other code has already been written on top of them and they're far harder to fix. Having untested code is referred to as technical debt, and it results in lowered velocity, compounding defects, and rising support costs as your customers encounter more issues. If your testers are at capacity, your developers should step in and help them test. If they're feeling the pain of testing, they may step in and automate more of it. We're almost done for today, but first, let's talk about the definition of done. Your team's definition of done is a list of all the tasks that must be completed before a feature can be considered complete. Everyone involved with delivering software can agree that software isn't done until it's tested, but what kind of tests? Automated unit tests? Automated integration tests? Manual testing? Here we've got an email that was sent inquiring about a major defect that found its way into production. Evidently, it was something that should have been caught during testing, and the Scrum Master is inquiring how this problem can be avoided next time. The tester's response reveals that due to time constraints during the last sprint, normal test procedures weren't followed. Evidently, the tester was under the impression that there wouldn't be a release when the sprint was complete, and so he could play catch-up during the current sprint. One of the core tenets of Agile frameworks is that when the team declares a story to be done, it needs to be in a releasable state. The product owner can declare a done feature to be ready for release at any time, after all. The definition of done is going to vary between teams. Obviously, a different level of detail will be needed for working with medical equipment versus working on a personal site. But it's important that the team have a shared definition of done. This will help avoid miscommunication when planning releases, and it'll also help keep needed testing from falling through the cracks. The Scrum team from today's examples is, of course, totally fictitious, but I bet you've seen some elements of what they do in your real-world projects. It's easy for a well-meaning Agile team to get a bit off track with regard to best practices, after all. I hope today's been a useful reminder of what the practices are, as well as the reasons behind them, and hopefully this will get you back on the road to successful Agile delivery. Thanks for watching.